billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lahu wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluhu. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad ajala farajum. Assalamu alaikum ya wa abdullahi Hussein. Well, we know that many of the slave people who came from the parts of Africa, and found people take DNA tests, came from areas of Africa that were Muslim. And so there were many Muslims incarcerated in the slave trade, and they came to America. The language of the marketplace of Charlestown, South Carolina, was Arabic, because Arabic was the language of commerce in West Africa. But through the process of slavery and the breaking of slaves, the taking of language, the taking of religion, not being a practice religion, then all of a sudden it starts to fade away. If you look after slavery and Reconstruction, all of a sudden you have the Moorish Science Temple popping up. And then from the Moorish Science Temple came Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam. You had three periods, slaves who were regular Muslims, probably following Maliki faith. Then you had the heterodox with the Nation of Islam. And then you have probably Orthodox Sunni Islam. And the reason I mention that is because from there, Shia Islam, African Americans grows out of that. So African American Shiism is a product of a whole stream of Islam from Africa into the Americas.
The history of Islam in African Americans really dates back to the original slaves that were brought here during the antebellum slave trade. I think most historians estimate that around 1/3 of the slaves that came over, mostly from West Africa, were Muslim.
When you look at historical accounts in America, there were always Muslims here in America with the Native Americans. We know from historical events in 1300s, you had Mansa Musa, who was the king of Ghana, and his brother Abu Bakr III made hijrah with 2,000 African Muslims to the New World. Islam was here already from way before slavery. So I think because the Christians was in power, the Crusaders, they imposed upon the blacks either accept Christianity or die.
You know, every day is Ashur, every land is Karbala. And I think that when we look at Malcolm's life, he's an embodiment of that, spiritually, metaphysically. People say, well, he might have met this person and that person was Shia. The only place I think personally in his life, from understanding, is in his diary. Malcolm, after he went to Mecca, he came back, he went back overseas. And he met with a lot of revolutionary people that are part of the Third World Revolutions. And he says in an autobiography that one of his guides gave him a tour of Egypt. And he was at Al-Azhar and got letters. But next to Al-Azhar, if you've been to Egypt, is Imam Hussein. They say Imam Hussein's head is there. When he goes to Al-Azhar, he says he visits the shrine of Imam Hussein. I'm sure Malcolm saying, well, who is this guy, Imam Hussein? Then he visits Zainab's grave, which we think is in Syria, but they think is in Egypt. His trip to Egypt, he definitely would have come in contact with the story of Imam Hussein and Zainab. Maybe 4 months later, he's martyred. A lot of African Americans, some African Americans, not a lot, started becoming Shia in a place called Beit el-Ilm, Fadil al-Hayri. And he had like a Sufi Shia thing in Plano, someplace in Texas. They would tell me how they went to this Sufi order, but it might have been 79, right around the revolution, but it wasn't, you know, some Inqilabi revolution. But before, there were still tendencies of African Americans who became Muslim, who kind of were following a tasawwuf or Sufi way. The African context, everybody was either Nation of Islam, even though it's not Islam technically, or Sunni Islam, and different Sunni organizations. But before 79, there's not too much documentation, let's say, of people who were Shia. The reason I believe there are not that many Shia before 79 is because I don't believe Shia Muslims in America do dawah. The Shias almost have become, in many parts of the world, especially before, this inclusive, like this is us. We don't talk to the Sunnis, we don't talk to non-Muslims. So there's not a lot of African Americans who are introduced before 79 because the Shias did not feel in reason to engage. If we look at Shia communities in America, let's say in Detroit area, right? The irony is right across all the black people in Detroit. You telling me you Arabs never could walk across the street to Detroit? I don't know too many black African American Shia communities before 79 as communities. But I do know for a fact that black people were engaged with Shia Iranians before 79. The revolution in Iran was comprised of multiple different groups who all wanted to get rid of the Shah, and get rid of U.S. interaction in there. So there's a group called CIS. So CIS was an organization of Iranian students, right? And these Iranian students were very active. They just weren't active in Iran. They're active in America. So they participated in the Black Panther parties and all the social movements and everything. So Iranians participated in many of the social movements of activism to help black people get their freedom. Why is this important when I look at it? Because Indo-Pacs didn't. Arabs didn't. Mustafa Shamran, he started the first MSA PSG up at UC Berkeley in the 1960s. That's a long time, that's 10 years before. So now they became engaged in the black community with Islam. You could say there was a pre-Dawah within the black community with Iranians. The ones who were Sunni Muslims, they started to learn about Shiism.
1980, mashallah. At the time, there was a hawza right off of my hometown in Buffalo, New York, in Medina, New York. But I was in Hawaii. I just got in the military. And I was literally praying and studying with Syed Masum Abidi at that time, mashallah, which is really, wasn't 80, it was about 81, 82. I might be one of the oldest living so-called African American Shias.
In the early 1970s, obviously there was a lot of black activism, right, in the US in general. And, I think my dad, along with many other, black Americans, were looking for, solutions to solve the problems of African Americans and black people here in the U.S., and also was looking for a complete way of life. He had met some members of the Nation of Islam. Their ideology and theology didn't resonate with him. It was actually while he was at Masjid al-Mu'min that he met his first Shia. He said, that the young brother spoke very intelligently. When they questioned him about, his prayer, his religious practice, he answered very intelligently and acutely. And that sort of, my dad, it was kind of something that always stuck in the back of his mind. One of the great benefits that happened, in the aftermath of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, right, was that there was a lot of books that were translated into English, right? So God bless the scholars and the mu'mineen, in Qom and in other places that realize that, hey, this is one of the most important things that needs to be done, is to translate this Islamic knowledge, make it available to Americans.
A lot of blacks have been, castigated for, centuries. And through the slavery in America, the cruelties of it, the tyranny upon Imam Hussein's descendants, it was a connection with that. Someone who sacrificed all things for God. Most blacks were Christians at first in America through slavery, imposition, and they followed Jesus Christ, and they didn't follow his suffering, the crucifixion, if you will. And a lot of women of African descent and men, they drew to that suffering of Jesus Christ. Reading the historical events of Imam Hussein, I believe personally, it was a connection, the suffering beyond any sacrifice known to mankind. When 70 companions die, they lose themselves for God. That is something that's a phenomenon.
The more that she looked into, the more historical information that she got, the more it became clear that, that this was haqq, this was truth. And you can't have truth without having justice. Obviously, they're hand in hand, they're married together. Of course, at the time we're talking about the civil rights movement, and my mother was an adolescent at that time. So it was just the perfect storm for her seeking and her search, in addition to the general societal upheaval at the time. I can tell you that we were the only African American Shia family in Philadelphia that I knew of.
One of the biggest splits that happened after the revolution amongst the MSA PSG was because of one person, Ali Shariati. Ali Shariati caused a split in understanding ideology. Everybody's Muslim, but the East Coast, they were like not really pro Ali Shariati. They were more, we need an alim. The alim is the person who's going to dictate everything. So we go to the alim. The West Coast, was more like, hey, no, we're intellectuals. Hey, we love the Alim. We're going to follow Imam Khomeini. But guess what, though? Locally, we don't need some Alim telling us everything. We're going to be more on the streets. We're not going to sit in the mosque and do fiqh. We're going to do this. When I go to the East Coast, it's more like I'm going overseas to study and I become an Alim. Therefore, now I have authority. When I give speeches, I'm a little eccentric probably in a way because I come from a understanding where, I'll talk about Panthers. We listen to music. We listen to hip hop. That's revolutionary, right? I started a basketball program when I became Muslim called the Oakland Soldiers, 1989. We started a basketball league to mentor, at that point, black men and do mentorship with black men and expand and everything. And we started working with black young men and using the soldier program as a way of, and I'm saying not doing dawah, but obviously most of the people who coach were Muslims and we're Shia Muslims. A lot of people who converted came through the program.
One of the brothers who was one of the former lieutenants in Elijah Muhammad's movement, in fact, he was a minister, in fact, a very heavy minister because he was in Masjid number 2. They didn't call it Masjid, they called it Temple 2. He was in Gary, Indiana. And he knew Elijah Muhammad personally. I mean, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad had him in his house, mashallah. So he had become Shia. MashaAllah, alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. When he came to the United States, he hooked up with these people who wanted us to do security for him. So we did security in San Diego. We were the force that put that crack, those people that were selling crack, that were all up above ground, we put them back under the ground, mashallah. We didn't kill anybody, but we made it clear that you can't do this here in this neighborhood, mashallah. Everybody thinks it was Elijah Muhammad in them. We were the first ones to do that, mashallah. So those people that were in that group all became Shia, except for maybe one, mashallah.
In mid-80s, Shia community in North America, those who were involved in running the centers, at that time they were feeling difficulty in inviting the scholars from back home. They came to the conclusion that we have to have homegrown and local scholars, local ulama, that who are born and raised here, they know the language, they know the culture, and they can better lead us and guide us. With that understanding, they started a hawza in Medina, New York. It started in 1986. We had about 30 to 40 students, male and female. Majority of them came from convert families, from Afro-American community. We produced about 40 to 50 young alims from there. Many of them, they went for their higher studies to Qom, and now many of them are back and serving in different communities.
In 1992, when we had the riots and everything, and the Bloods and Crips were fighting each other, Brother Mujahid was the only person who brought together the Crips and Bloods and had a peace treaty. I loved his philosophy because his philosophy was, and he's right about this, the Arabs were different tribes and the Messenger of Allah brought them together. He never dismantled the tribe. He Islamified the tribe. And he wanted to Islamify and bring all these different groups together, and he did. And that treaty has still been in place since 1992. So to me, it's beautiful to see how Shia Islam and people with Shia thinking were able to look at the Sunnah of the Ahlulbayt, the Sunnah of the Imams and the Prophet, and bring people together. People keep forgetting, Abu Zar was a thug. He was a gangster. He came from a tribe of gangsters. And it was interesting because the story goes, he came to Mecca to hear about this prophet. And he sees Imam Ali at the Kaaba, he follows Imam Ali, and he gets to Prophet Muhammad Islam, and the Prophet starts talking about Islam. And when he talks about Islam, he says, where are you from? Two things that I liked about the Prophet Islam. The Prophet, usually when I meet somebody, I say, hey man, where you from? Then we talk. Prophet did not say where you're from. He talked about Allah first. Then after he did dawah, he said, where you from? And Abu Zar says, I'm from the tribe of Ghaffar. And they say the Prophet said, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, like wow, Allah has brought somebody. So obviously the Prophet knew that this tribe was thugs along the path. And Abu Dhar take Shahada. He goes to Mecca, gets beat up because he was like really this gung-ho revolutionary. I mean, like enthusiast, zealot. And then he got beat up. Prophet said, hey, do me a favor. Just go back to your tribe. I'll let you know when time is right. He goes back to his tribe, and that whole tribe takes Shahada. And then in the wars with the Quraysh, like their tribe would rob, so they would do all that criminality they did, now becomes Islamified. I think that's how Brother Mujahid and me as people see gangs. That you get to the leaders and take all that negative energy, that negative criminality, and can we turn that for God? You know, because it's already organized, they have leadership. So if one person go, the whole tribe goes, and I think that's what I noticed in LA. You know, what he did was get with people who already have a structure. Gangs are structures. Prophet Muhammad did dawah both ways. He did get dawah to structures and tribes, and he did individuals. And I think that is something that Brother Mujahid and Watts was able to do.
Majority of the Shias that were here were not involved in revolution. The majority of the people that came into the religion wanted to revolutionize their lives, and they wanted to see this nation revolutionized. They wanted to see the whole world revolutionized. Why? Because if you are a religionist and you believe in the oneness of Allah, then there is no way in the world that you can believe in such foolishness as nationalism and racism and ethnocentricity, all the egocentricities, right? And so the majority of us who had came in the religion before the 70s, mashallah, in the 60s with Elijah Muhammad and them, everybody on that level that wanted to take an Islamic name and have an Islamic identity, that wanted to pray 5 times a day, were in the process of revolution. And the majority of the Shias that were here were not in this process. The thing that I've been trying to preach for the last, what now, going on 40 years, 30-something years, mashallah, that you live in a country that guarantees your freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, and freedom of speech. You're no longer under Zia Haq's Pakistan, mashallah. You're no longer in that situation. But if you don't exercise these freedoms, you're liable to lose them.
Sunnis do dawah. They're just not doing as much. The Shia do no dawah. The Shias sit in the mosque and hit themselves, you know what I'm saying? Or somehow, and I'm very critical of us, I think better, they want to do a jalous down New York Street, and I'm like, and I say I'm black, I'm sitting back, I'm like, okay, these are a bunch of people hitting themselves, and they're doing, I have no idea what they're doing. I say this all the time. If the Prophet Muhammad would have stayed in that mountain, where would we be?
The bonds that exist between the Shia immigrant community and the indigenous community are not ideal, to say the minimum. The immigrant community being more affluent and more financially capable, they have a bigger responsibility in reaching out to the African American community that is mostly poor. The African American community deserves more of our support, more of our attention, and more of our resources.
One of the biggest problems in the Shia Muslim community is marriage. Marriage is the problem here more than anything, because marriage brings families together, but tribes together, cultures together, and races together. The sunnah of the Prophet Ahlulbayt is that they married outside of Arabs. What becomes the solution? Muta. Most of the mutas that the brothers here have is because they have to marry somebody, so they marry a Christian or a Jew, and alhamdulillah, many of the women have become Muslims. Many of our communities are people who are mixed with Muslims who have a Jewish, like in my case, muta. Other guys have Christians, and so all of a sudden you asked about sectarianism, marriage is crushing. It crushes it because like we all family still.
If you migrate to another country, your main priority, right, is sort of preservation of self, preservation of identity, preservation of culture. Those aren't things that African Americans that were living here that become Muslim, that isn't a priority for us, right? Our identity, you know, a lot of times is very clear and comfortable. We're not, we don't have that same, you know, lived experience. I think it's okay for different groups to potentially have different priorities. You know, I very much am of the belief that, you know, I mean, obviously as Muslims we need to all work together, but I'm very much of the belief that African American communities, we have our own particular issues and priorities that we want to promote. We need to focus on and do it ourselves. If the immigrant community, the Irani community, if they want to help or support that, great. If not, we have to do it.
It takes all of us. As long as it's going to be African Americans over here and Pakistanis over here and Afghans over here, it's going to always be just like church. That's what it's going to be. Once a week, it's just feckless, no power at all. Not even power to help your own children rise. And if you're going to send them to school, what do you think going to happen?
The future of African American Shias, that I'm very, excited for, is to continue to try to follow in those footsteps of, of the people that, came into Islam and eventually to the path of Ahlulbayt, in the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s, to continue to try to be that guiding light and to bring our fellow countrymen, and our fellow neighbors into this beautiful way of life.
You got Shias on the west side, Shias on the east, Shias on the west, and you don't have a congruency of cohesion together. This is a movement that's Islamic for humanity. And for Imam Zaman, we have to be on point, Habibi. Gotta be the ones on the frontier advocating change and social justice. I mean, his lessons, brother, are vital. If they learn about Imam Hussein, brother, and the Imams in general, you would have an emboldened character amongst them, amongst our people. And you would have a spirit of resistance against oppression. We would have no fear. So I think if they adapted that way of life as Shia Muslims in America, we can change the ghettos, brother, overnight.